You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 12th of September 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Briefing in association with Addis. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Tom Edwards. Coming up on today's programme, Brazil's former president, Bolsonaro, is sentenced to decades in prison for plotting a coup in order to retain power after his defeat in the country's 2022 elections. Fernando Augusto Pacheco will share his reactions later, but he's here now. Faye, what do you make of the verdict?
Hello, Tom. A historic day for Brazilian democracy. We unveil the impact of Bolsonaro's sentence.
More from Faye in just a moment. Also ahead, Carlota Rebelo will join us to bring us up to date on the funicular tragedy that struck in Lisbon last week. Carlota, what's the latest?
The investigation is still continuing, Tom, but on the background of all of this, we have the mayoral election in Lisbon, and without a doubt, this tragedy will play a big part in the upcoming debates.
More from Carlota coming up. All that, plus we'll head to Tokyo, where galleries from around the world are gathering for the Gendai Art Fair. That is what we have for you today here on The Briefing with me, Tom Edwards. A very warm welcome to Friday's briefing. We start in Brazil and the convictions for Jair Bolsonaro for plotting a military coup in the aftermath of the 2022 elections, in which he was, of course, defeated. I'm joined now with more by Monocle's senior correspondent and resident Brazilian Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Faye, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Tom. Good afternoon.
Faye, now you've got a spread of the papers. Bolsonaro condenado, even I can translate that one, 27 años de prisão for the former incumbent. Tell me, what do you make of this? Is he actually going to spend any time in the old Grey Bar Hotel?
That's the big question. I mean, it was a big sentence, 27 years. So even Folha de São Paulo, which is, a very centrist newspaper, is saying that the decision was absolutely fair, but they thought the sentence was exaggerated. But listen, Tom, it's a historic day nevertheless, because this never happened in Brazil and in many countries, I have to say, to sentence a former leader for plotting against democracy practically. And I think this is very important, especially in a country like Brazil. Listen, we are a recent democracy, if you think about it. Our first real election was in 1989, even though the dictatorship ended in the mid-80s or something like that. So I think it's kind of, looking at our past a little bit. And I think Brazil didn't do that very well like other countries, even in the region like Chile and Argentina. There was an amnesty in a way. Like, let's forget what happened. So when Bolsonaro tried to do something similar, basically plotting a coup. I mean, there's been many documents that prove that. So I think it was good that this decision was made as well.
Faye, it's interesting, as you said, to reflect on the history, but looking forward, as much of this, I guess, it's less about the actual detail of the sentence, whether it's commuted or partly commuted, whether he serves it suspended or whether he is under some form of house arrest. Perhaps more significant is the fact that he's barred from running for office until, I think, 2060, sort of to run concurrently. Is this the end of Bolsonaro as somebody on ballot papers? I guess is probably the more prescient question.
I don't think it's the end of Bolsonaro, first of all, because he's got many kids and they are involved in politics, literally all of them. And even his wife, Michelle Bolsonaro, some people are saying that she could be a candidate for the presidential elections next year. So there will be a percentage of Brazilians that will always vote Bolsonaro, but I wouldn't compare him to Trump. His position is weakened and not all members of the Brazilian right will still support Bolsonaro after this decision. So some very important names like Tarcísio Freitas is the governor of São Paulo from the right. He did say that he didn't agree with that, but of course he had to say that because, he's a kind of a loyal ally. But I'm sure next year, if he will be the main candidate, I think he would kind of have to forget Bolsonaro if he really wants to win the election. So I think the right in Brazil already looking at other options there. It's not all about Bolsonaro, unlike in the US, which I genuinely think it's all about Trump.
We'll come to Trump in a second. So if I interpret correctly, you're saying maybe we don't see Jair Bolsonaro, but the Bolsonaro name, the dynasty could run. And we've seen this. Brazil, they love a dynastic name, right? What's the draw, Faye? I mean, there's so many potential candidates, a vast democracy with hundreds of millions of people. Why are you and your fellow countrymen and women so drawn to these dynastic names, even if they're slightly despotic?
It's frustrating. And even someone from the left like Lula, I mean, he's still going to be the candidate again, and he's getting older. He's not that popular, Lula. There has been a little, because there was a new poll talking about his approval rate. There was a small uptick, but nothing spectacular, to be really honest with you.
And he's been a jailbird, albeit briefly, just to try.
Exactly. And I think we should really follow what's going to happen in the next days, because there's a sentence. It is a big day. But listen, I've been in Brazil for long. We've been reading the stories. Something could happen. And Jair Bolsonaro is 70 years old. I think because of his age, he might actually be able to do his sentence at home. But one interesting fact here, Tom, the streets of Brasilia were empty yesterday. Some people were expecting that his supporters were going to kind of rally in favor of him. That didn't quite happen. Maybe they will plan protests soon, but maybe that just shows you that his position, actually, it is quite weakened after this sentence.
Very interesting. Faye, just briefly, you mentioned Trump earlier, and perhaps we should not have been surprised that he immediately, I think, took to Truth Social to weigh in on this. A fellow wannabe autocrat, yes. A sort of strong man. He was, of course, called the Trump of the tropics, which was a bit of a cliche, but I think that obviously probably appealed to the original and worse. Is it helpful? Is it unhelpful that Trump weighs in? Why does he feel the need to do this? It's interesting because he seems to set about continuing to weaken potential and former allies, even of the US, with his pronouncements. Why does he weigh in, and what do people back home make of his unhelpful interventions?
I mean, very unhelpful. I think he already criticized the decision. He's promising new sanctions. Marco Rubio said that there is a witch hunt happening in Brazil. The thing is, it will weaken perhaps Brazil's economy a little bit. We discussed the tariffs recently, but Brazil is lucky that we are a big country. We're a big economy. We have other business partners. So I think if Brazil was a little bit weaker, maybe more dependent on the US economy, maybe that would affect more. But thankfully, no. Thankfully, the Brazil's relationship with China keeps on growing. The Mercosur-EU kind of agreement finally is happening. So there will be an impact on, but I actually don't think this impact will be as huge as some people were expecting.
Fernando, excellent insights as always, and we'll obviously keep a very close eye on what actually happens, whether that sentence is commuted or changed in some form in the days and weeks ahead. That was our Fernando Augusto Pacheco making sense of the Bolsonaro news for us. Plenty happening around the world. Let's hear from Tom Webb, who's standing by with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Tom. Russia and Belarus have begun a major joint military exercise 2 days after Poland shot down Russian drones that crossed into its airspace. The Zapad 2025 exercise is a show of force by Moscow and its close ally, taking place in training sites, including some that are close to the Polish border. Meanwhile, France has deployed 3 Rafale jets to help protect Polish airspace. The FBI has released video footage of the suspect in the shooting of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. The video shows what is thought to be a college-age male running across a rooftop and dropping to the ground before running into a wooded area. Kirk was fatally shot by a sniper while being questioned about gun violence during an event at a university in Utah earlier this week. And entrepreneurs hoping to move to Japan will soon have to pass a language test. The nation's Immigration Services Agency is planning to add Japanese language proficiency as a condition for entrepreneurial visas, as an attempt to promote better integration with local residents and mitigate potential friction with society. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Tom.
Thanks very much indeed, Tom. More news coming your way at the top of the next hour, and we'll be off to Japan a little bit later in this programme. But it is to Lisbon where we head next. The city is continuing to seek answers and a path forward following the devastating funicular accident in which 16 people lost their lives last week. I'm joined now in the studio by Monocle's executive producer, Carlota Rebelo, of course, a Portuguese native. Carlota, good afternoon. Bring us up to speed, because so often in these cases, people want culpability. They want somebody to blame. at whom are our fingers pointing? Now a little more information has come to light.
Yes, the investigation is still continuing, Tom, and it's interesting to see the preliminary report, because so far all the preliminary findings seem to be to avoid pointing fingers at one person or one entity, which I'm not saying it is the correct or incorrect way of moving forward, but the report says that a cable failure was the cause of the disaster, and that despite the brakes being activated, which then obviously exonerates the driver's responsibility, the brakes were not able to stop the cabins from sliding down the hill. There's findings now that some of the maintenance that was mandatory, instead of lasting the time that it was meant to last, it was done very quickly, and also that 6 years ago the type of cable used by these systems was replaced by the equivalent of TfL, so Carris, the Metropolitan Transport Authority, by a different type of material. Of course, at the time they were assured was better, more efficient, etc. But of course, this accident happened 6 years into this new cable being installed. So now there are questions about whether or not that was actually a good decision. Now, we need to remember that on top of all of this, there's as well the pressure for city residents, because for people who know the steep hill in which this happened, the funicular, while yes, very popular with tourists, was very, very popular with residents too. If they lived or worked in downtown Lisbon but had to commute to the top of the hill, that was the easiest and quickest way to get to the top. So today, City Hall announced an alternative transport to connect Gloria to Gloria, and this is, of course, a sort of funicular replacement bus that will go from the Rocio Square up to Gloria while they continue the investigation. The street has reopened for pedestrian traffic, but I think it will be a long while until we see another funicular up and down.
And it's, I think, 3 million people a year just on the Gloria funicular. It's a key artery to keep the city moving. Now, Carlotta, you mentioned at the top of the show mayoral elections, and I suppose there's always a reluctance to kind of play politics where this has been a question of life and death, but nevertheless there are lots of calls for the incumbent to resign, and quite naturally this accident is going to be central to the discussions, the debates I know that are forthcoming. How is it going to reshape the narrative around the municipal election? Because one senses this is going to really be the only kind of conversation in town.
Exactly. And it is a real shame, not just, of course, for the tragic loss of lives, but the election is exactly a month on from today, on the 12th of October. And there are a lot of other issues that Lisbon needs to face. We know over-tourism is becoming one of them. The housing crisis is a major one. We have more and more people moving out of the city centre into the periphery, and, that then impacts jobs, impacts transports, impacts everything. But sadly, this tragedy is going to permeate all of the discussions around this. Mayor Carlos Moedas has been facing calls to resign, not necessarily because of his handling or of this, or because people believe he's at fault, but because in the past, when previous mayors had to have some slight scandals that weren't as catastrophic as this, he was adamant about their resignation. So it's almost like calling him on his own past remarks. And there's been, on TV and on the radio and across newspapers, members of the opposition using Moedas' own remarks against him and saying, well, why was that valid when I was president and it's not valid when it's you? The crash very much resulted of a mechanical failure. That's what everyone, including the mayor, keeps saying. Now they are trying to find what led to that mechanical failure, but they have excluded the possibility of being human, which is a good news, because then it's different when the responsibility falls on an individual, isn't it? And we know the pressures there. Now, there is talk that a vote of no confidence, a censure motion, as we call them in Portuguese politics, will happen in City Hall sometime this week. But the mayor's team has put out a statement saying that they see this only as political opportunism. And exactly as you mentioned, Tom, we have the mayoral debates happening in just a couple of weeks, and it's already a known fact that this disaster, this tragedy, the reaction to it and what happens next will be, without a doubt, at the top of the list.
Is it an election that Mayor Carlos then can't win, or does it depend how he navigates this next fractious kind of period, just briefly?
I really think it's going to be decided in these debates. You know, Carlos Moedas won the first time when no one expected him to win. The eve of the elections, Medina, who was the incumbent then, all the polls, all the projections said he had 72% of the vote, and Carlos Moedas ended up surprising everyone and won. So he clearly strikes a chord with many Lisboetas. Now, I think how he's going to play out the narrative of what happens after this, how he's going to perform in those debates and continue to address some of those other issues I mentioned is going to be the decisive factor here.
Carlotta, thanks for being with us. That's our Carlotta Rebelos, bringing up to speed on events in Lisbon on the briefing here on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, it's emerged this morning that Giorgio Armani's will has instructed his heirs and executors to sell the brand or potentially seek IPO. For a quick reaction to this breaking news story this morning, I'm joined now by Monocle's luxury markets editor, Brenda Tui. Good afternoon, Brenda.
Hi, Tom. It's directly the opposite of what Giorgio Armani said in 2023. He said he wasn't going to sell, but now it transpires that he is going to sell. He has instructed that 15% of his company be sold to one of the trio of biggies. He wants that done. And then in the next 5 years after his death, he has suggested that they sell between 30 and 54.9%.
No, it's really interesting because I was talking to Tyler Brulé, of course, Monocle's founder, just right after the news broke of the passing of Giorgio Armani, and he was again, fascinated by the potential succession story. And that's always something of a thorny issue. But as you rightly point out there, Brenda, what's really arresting about Armani was, in so many ways, the power of his brand, personally and in business terms, was his maintenance of total control and his reluctance to even countenance divesting. It just goes to show that, you know, maybe he was playing a different game than everyone else, almost. The fact that he must have had this in mind. But it does speak to the same rigour, his planning, that he's been so specific, right? It's kind of extraordinary.
It is quite incredible. I mean, Armani's partner, Leo Dell'Orco, has 30% of the company. He also has 40% of the voting rights. So who knows? I mean, he might, change things a little bit, but it looks like 15% is going to be sold to one of those three big companies. Now, Armani already has licensing relationships with Luxottica for eyewear, with L'Oreal for some fragrances and beauty. So maybe they're favorites. Who knows?
Brenda, thanks for making sense of that for us. Fascinating story. We'll watch it very carefully. That was our Brenda Tui joining us here on The Briefing. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, before we wrap up the show, let's head to Japan. The Tokyo Gendai International Art Fair opened today in Yokohama and runs through the weekend. It brings together more than 60 galleries from more than a dozen countries and showcases the strength of Japan's art market. Our Ryuma Takahashi is there and has been speaking with the fair's director, Eri Takane.
I'd say it's international affairs. We are having international and local galleries together, and it's a meeting point for everybody, including galleries, collectors, artists, and art-related people together, and create a dialogue between the two. This time we also have quite major galleries like Pace Galleries and Gallery Eva, President Hoover, City Calls, but we also have a quite great Japanese local galleries like Koyama Tomio, Takaishi, and the Kaikai Kiki. So you will see and also discover some new artists through the fairs.
According to a report released last year by Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs, Japan's art market continues to grow. The growth rate has been 11% since 2019, significantly outpacing the global art market growth rate of just 1%. She says that for further growth in Japan's art industry, platforms that connect artists and collectors are important.
There are lots of actually young galleries happening and opening up, and also there's also young collectors. I think the increased number of young collectors happening especially after COVID. So I think there's a huge potential in the future for people to actually create the artworks, but also for people to buy the artworks too. So like the foundation here in Japan is already fixed and firmed, I think. But we are thinking like maybe there is a missing opportunity for galleries to sell the artworks at the one platform. So by building these art fairs in Tokyo, I'm hoping like it will give the opportunity for everyone to come and enjoy art, of course, but like are able to buy arts at the site.
A representative from Kaikai Kiki, a gallery participating in Tokyo Gendai, speaks on-site about how Tokyo Gendai is important to their business.
First of all, our gallery is called Kaikai Kiki Gallery, and people commonly know our gallery as the gallery of Takashi Murakami. So he's the gallery owner. However, it's a gallery of new emerging artists who are under Takashi Murakami, who are hopefully going to continue the legacy of the next Japanese contemporary artists. First mission for our participation to such domestic art fairs would be to definitely get to know more collectors. It's very important for Kaikai Kiki because this is the place for new connections to happen. Of course, we can always welcome new collectors and visitors to come visit our gallery directly in Tokyo. However, sometimes people make their visit to overseas for art fairs most of the times rather than a specific show at a gallery. So it's definitely a place where the market gets a little lively. We do not want to miss out on that chance.
According to the Agency for Culture Affairs report, Japan has many small galleries with affordable artworks comprising the majority of the market, and individual collectors are increasing. In this context, Takane shares the tips for enjoying Tokyo Gendai.
All the galleries, they have the representatives at the booth. So if you are curious about the price, you can just ask. You'll be surprised by the scales. And also, we use 3.5 meters height, the wall. So it's quite big. So you are free to come to the booth and you can freely see the artworks. So it's more like, I think, there's no intimidations like when you step into the art fair. So you have to experience it. I think like you have to really see it in person. I think in general, like for contemporary arts, everything, you cannot see everything only online. But when you see it in person, you will feel differently. So I'm hoping like you will come visit and enjoy the fair.
For Monocle in Yokohama, I'm Ryuma Takahashi.
Thanks to Ryuma for that report. And that is all we have time for on today's edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Laura Kramer, our researcher was Daniela Brorsmith, and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. Thanks to them all. We'll be back at the same time on Monday, 1300 CET, noon here in London. I'm Tom Edwards. Goodbye and thank you very much for listening.